Hi there, my name is Schulz. I'm a tutor at the Edison Writing Center. Today's screencast is going to discuss how to identify literary devices that can help your commentary in HL English. A question I get a lot as a tutor in the Writing Center is, do I really need literary devices? The answer is yes. Yes, you do. I know it's a bit blunt, but in reality, literary devices really do aid your writing and are required by IB. So why do I need literary devices? So you need literary devices because they are ways that we identify what an author has done in his text, in his or her text. So literary devices are really essentially just observations of the author's choices in a recognized in more formal language. So there's a literary device for pretty much everything because we have to be able to name pretty much any type of thing we can observe in a writing piece. So literary devices extend beyond what you've been told they are probably in your earlier years, and they're not just metaphors, similes, onomatopoeia. There are literary devices that describe very basic things that can help you formally argue a very high-level literary argument. So there are a specific set of literary devices that are pretty general and easy to find in most writing, and those are syntax, diction, characterization, and imagery. So syntax refers to sentence structure, and so you read sentences. So if the structure of that sentence is interesting, you can make an observation about it, and that happens more often than you would think, because if the author chooses to list, to very bluntly say something, to write a fragmented sentence, or a very, very long sentence, those are all observations that you can note and identify to use in your argument. Also, there's diction, and diction refers to word choice. Since all quotes will have words, it's a pretty reliable thing to have as a fallback. So if you have a very valuable quote but you can't find anything to identify in it, often diction is a good literary device to identify because it can be used along with some sort of descriptor to identify something that changes the meaning of the text. For example, angry diction might change the impression the reader has on some character or some event or some idea. There's also characterization, and often I find that when a tutee comes to me wanting to use plot to argue a topic, what they're essentially trying to do is to use characterization. And characterization just refers to how does the author portray a character, and maybe like what motivates the character, what a character's qualities are. So essentially, how does the author build the character? And so often the plot will create the type of character that you're discussing, and often that the behavior of that character will allow the author to create theme and to control a lot of the emotions of the reader. So it's a very, very valuable literary device, and a lot of literary devices also have the secondary effect of characterizing characters, obviously. So, and finally, there's also imagery, and imagery is also pretty common. And essentially, if you can find an area where something is described in a way that it evokes images, then you can identify it as imagery, which happens very, very often as a author tries often to entertain as well as inform the reader through imagery. So if a literary device is not obvious to find, I often suggest to my tutees to work backwards. So what I usually tell them is to figure out what they want to argue first, because usually someone who has a good idea of the purpose of a commentary is able to identify what they believe the author is saying, but has a harder time saying why they think that. So first, I ask them what they think the text is about, and once they've identified that, we go on to figure out what part of the text makes them think that. So if there's a passage where some character describes their past, and it discusses, and it's associated with the theme that you're trying to argue, maybe that's a section that you decide to focus on. So part 3 involves identifying what part of the text what part of the text alters your meaning, so alters your understanding. So what is it about the text? So is it like that it evokes an angriness? Is it that it shows what the author, it shows some emotion that the reader should have towards the topic, and that will lead you towards deciding what literary device could have that effect. So let's run through some examples so that this process is more clear. So this quote from The Woman Warrior, I chose because I believed it discussed how different cultures have different understandings of how different events should be handled. So this quote discusses how the author is not sure of how to handle relationships in America. So she says, "But of course I hexed myself also, no dates. I should have stood up, both arms waving, and shouted across libraries, 'Hey you, love me back.'" So I've identified that the part that really makes me think what I think is this second part, "Hey you, love me back." So now I have to decide what literary device could have this effect. So my first question asks me, does it create some image in your mind or describe something? And it doesn't really evoke any images for me, especially not the second part, "Hey you, love me back." But on the other hand, the second question, does the part sound blunt, short, or does it sound oddly long? It does seem very short because "Hey you" and "love me back" are both very short sentences, and they evoke a bluntness, right? So we could use it to discuss how there's an obvious disconnect between the author's understanding of relationships and what is really expected of her. So in this case, we would use that to identify it as a type of shortened syntax, which we could then use to argue some point about culture and understanding alternative roles in those new cultures. So another example, I chose this quote because I was considering the topic of bravery and standing up for what you believe in, and so I was thinking that Brave Orchid's interactions with her fellow students really showed her bravery, right? And it says, "Two of her roommates walked her to the ghost room. 'Aren't you afraid?' they asked. 'What is there to be afraid of?' Brave Orchid asked. 'What could a ghost do to me?'" And so I thought especially it was her when she said, "What is there to be afraid of?" Right? And she seemed very fearless. So I need to find a literary device that allows me to show how Brave Orchid is fearless. So it doesn't really evoke any image again. And maybe you could argue that there's some sort of questioning syntax because there's a lot of questions. And she answers a question with a rhetorical question. But the third question, does it change the way you think about a character, is probably more useful, because it alters our understanding of the qualities of Brave Orchid because she's portrayed as more courageous when she says, "What is there to be afraid of?" So in this case, we would say that she's characterized as either courageous or fearless, and we could use that in our discussion of bravery. And then another example, I was trying to discuss to see how Hong Kingston discussed her cultural context. And so I found a part where she said the revolutionaries had taken fourth aunt and uncle's store, house and lands. They attacked the house and killed granddaughter and oldest daughter. And so specifically, I noticed that there was a lot of aggression. And so what I tried to do is I tried to find a literary device that could evoke this aggression that I noticed. So I didn't notice any imagery, per our first question. And the second one about syntax, the syntax is pretty standard. You might say that it's irregular, how there's no articles or possessive words used here, but it's not, it doesn't really aid our understanding of the cultural context. The characterization is difficult to use here because we don't really have a lot of context on fourth aunt and uncle's store or granddaughter and oldest daughter. So it's not really the best literary device to use here since they're not really characters in the story. But there are words, so we can always fall back on diction in this case. So you can see that there's some very aggressive, violent diction, like taken and attacked and killed. So you could use these and say that she used aggressive or violent diction to discuss communism or her cultural context. So in this way, you could use a literary device, even though there's no really obvious literary devices like a simile or a metaphor or an alliteration, but you can still use literary devices that are attached to your argument. And in this way, you'll find that literary devices are far more relevant, because if you know what you're trying to prove and then you find quotes and identify the literary device in them that makes you think that, I think you'll realize that literary devices are just a more formal way of arguing a very advanced argument.